Several viewers have asked questions about the possibility of NATO's military intervention into Tigray. Is there any likelihood of surgical airstrikes or implementation of a no-fly zone over Tigray by NATO? In last night's live chat session, some viewers asked questions about this possibility as well. So I thought of having a detailed look at these questions. In order to answer these questions, we must have a look at how NATO works. And we need to have a look at NATO's past military operations. When NATO intervened in Serbia, Libya, Afghanistan, who mandated NATO? Was UN on board or not? Can NATO unilaterally intervene into a conflict or not? Firstly, it's a 30-member body, NATO, which was formed on the principle of mutual self-defense. It means that if any of these 30 countries is facing an external threat, other NATO member countries are bound to help that country which is under threat. And no African country is part of NATO views. NATO can intervene without any approval by the UN Security Council. But in past interventions, we saw that in most cases of military interventions by NATO, NATO was mandated by UN viewers. Over the past few years, we have seen several military interventions by NATO. For example, in 1992, NATO carried out a naval blockade of Serbia, viewers. This naval blockade was mandated by a UN resolution. Then the same year, 1992, NATO implemented a no-fly zone over Bosnian airspace. Again, viewers, it was NATO was given mandate by the UN through resolution to implement no-fly zone. Then in 1999, NATO conducted air operation against Kosovo and Serbia. Views. Again, UN was on board to some extent. Then coming to Afghanistan, viewers, in 2001, NATO intervened in Afghanistan after an attack on World Trade Center in September 21, viewers, in the US. Again, viewers, UN Security Council unanimously approved NATO military intervention in Afghanistan. Then in 2011, viewers, NATO militarily intervened in Libya. Here again, UN Security Council gave mandate to NATO to intervene in Libya. Military intervention in Libya was mandated by NATO, by the UN viewers. And we have seen some cases in which a member country of NATO called for help as well. For example, in 2012, Turkey called for help. Turkey said that it was in danger and it needed air defense system against Syrian missiles. So NATO deployed long-range air defense systems. American Patriot air defense systems were deployed in Turkey against Syrian missiles. Syria is not part of NATO views. Deployment of air defense systems by NATO in Turkey, this deployment was not mandated by the UN. It was requested by Turkey, and being a member of the NATO, Turkey had this right to call for help. So you see, viewers, in most cases, NATO's military interventions, they were mandated by UN Security Council. Now, the next question. Could we see a NATO intervention in Tigray? Because there is no possibility of a UN mandated military intervention by NATO into Tigray. We have seen that the UN Security Council has been divided On the 21st of April, UN Security Council issued its first unanimous statement on Tigray war. It was a very weak statement. I did a video on that. In that video, UN Security Council only called for unfettered humanitarian access and for independent investigations into human rights abuses. Even there was no mention of the withdrawal of Eritrean forces and Amhara forces in that resolution views. And Ethiopian government narrative prevailed at the UN Security Council in that session. The US tried to convince other members to impose sanctions on Ethiopia. But the US could not convince all the members, and we saw a very weak statement at the UN Security Council. So there is no possibility of a UN-backed NATO intervention into Tigray. So then we are left with unilateral military intervention by NATO into Tigray, and that can be done definitely by the US. US, along with some of its allies like the UK, Italy, and Australia, can work on unilateral NATO intervention into Tigray without any approval at the UN Security Council. But so far we have seen views that the US has adopted a diplomatic approach. US has imposed sanctions, it has imposed visa restrictions, it is trying to involve other countries like Kenya, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. The US has appointed an envoy, Jeffrey Feltman, who is in this region, and he is trying to put pressure upon Ethiopia by involving other countries. US is not going for any military intervention so far. We haven't seen any statement by Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, about any intervention in Tigray. So far, in my opinion, there does not seem to be high probability of a military intervention by NATO into Tigray. Ethiopia is not a member of NATO as well, because TPLF cannot call NATO for help as well. So that is why in the coming days we will definitely see pressure upon Ethiopian government, but it would be diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, more sanctions. Other countries will put pressure upon Ethiopia. Up till now, in my view, there is no possibility of a military intervention by NATO into Tigray views. Nothing for watching.